Okay, let's just jump right in. We're going to talk about how a seemingly simple tax on paper ended up kicking off a huge political firestorm.
A firestorm that really changed history. We're talking about the Stamp Act of 1765.
And it's such a perfect example of how a fight over money can become, a fight over rights and identity.
Exactly. You might think, a tax on paper, what's the big deal? But it really struck at the very heart of who the colonists thought they were.
So let's set the scene for you. Britain had just fought this massive, incredibly expensive war, the 7 Years' War.
Right, what we often call the French and Indian War.
And the British government's logic was, well, pretty simple. They thought, we spent a fortune defending the American colonies, so it's only fair they help pay for it.
So in 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act. And this wasn't some minor tax. It was on almost every piece of paper you can imagine.
Seriously, think about your daily life. It covered legal documents, licenses, newspapers.
Even playing cards. And to prove you'd paid, an official would put this special embossed stamp on the paper.
So the core of the problem wasn't even the tax itself, was it? It was something bigger.
It was much bigger. The colonists had absolutely zero representatives in the British Parliament. None.
And that was their whole argument. They believed that only their own local governments, the people they actually voted for, could tax them.
That's the key distinction. This wasn't just about money. It was about authority.
So help us understand that a bit more. I mean, Britain had taxed them before with import duties and things like that. Why was this one so different?
That's a great question. And it comes down to the difference between an external tax and an internal tax.
Okay.
The taxes they were used to were external duties on goods coming into the ports. The colonists sort of saw that as Britain regulating trade, which they accepted.
But the Stamp Act was internal.
Exactly. It was a direct tax on business happening inside the colonies. It felt like Parliament was reaching right into their local affairs.
Which is what sparked that famous phrase we all know.
No taxation without representation.
It's so direct. It just perfectly captures the idea that you can't be taxed without your consent, without having a voice.
It really does. If we don't vote for you, you can't take our property. Simple as that.
Now, I have to assume Parliament had a response to that. They must have had some kind of legal reason for thinking they could do this.
Oh, they did. They had a concept they called virtual representation.
Virtual representation? What on earth is that?
Well, their argument was that every member of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere.
So even if you lived in Boston and couldn't vote for them, they were still, in theory, representing you.
That was the idea. That you were virtually represented.
I can't imagine the colonists bought that for a second.
Not for a second. They called it a legal fiction. They wanted actual representation, someone from their own community who they actually voted for, speaking for them.
And that disagreement just lit the fuse. The anger was immediate.
And it was everywhere. It wasn't just, rich merchants. It brought together people from all 13 colonies, from all different walks of life.
You had key figures step up almost immediately, like Patrick Henry in Virginia.
Right. He got up in the Virginia legislature and basically said any attempt by Parliament to tax Virginians was illegal. Full stop.
And people didn't just stay home and agree. They went out into the streets. But it quickly became more than just talking, didn't it?
It did. They realized that petitions weren't going to be enough. They needed to make the law impossible to enforce.
Which brings us to the Sons of Liberty. This wasn't just a protest group. They were a pretty serious, organized, and sometimes secret operation.
They were very strategic. You had leaders like Samuel Adams, but you also had dock workers, shopkeepers, artisans. They had influence, and they had, street power.
And their goal was simple.
Make it so that not a single one of those stamp papers could be sold.
And their methods were pretty intense.
Extremely intense. They didn't go after Parliament itself. They went after the local guys who were appointed to be the stamp tax collectors.
What did they do?
They used intimidation. They would create these crude dolls, these effigies of the tax officials, and hang them from trees.
Wow.
Then they'd parade them through the streets and burn them in massive bonfires. They would sometimes destroy the officials' homes.
That's a huge risk, though. Weren't some colonists worried that this was going too far, that it could lead to a military crackdown?
Oh, absolutely. There was always a tension between the protesters who wanted to stick to petitions and boycotts and the more radical groups using violence.
But the radical approach worked.
It did. Most of the appointed tax collectors ended up resigning because they were genuinely afraid for their lives and their families. Suddenly, Britain has a law that nobody is there to enforce.
And beyond the intimidation, people just refused to participate. They wouldn't buy the stamped paper.
Which basically ground business to a halt. Courts couldn't operate. Some businesses had to close. It was a kind of massive civil disobedience.
They also use symbols, right, to show their protest.
Yeah, powerful symbols. They'd fly flags at half-mast, calling it the death of liberty. And they started wearing homespun clothing instead of buying British cloth.
So your clothes became a political statement.
A very powerful one.
What's so interesting is how they moved from street protests to, well, unified political action. They knew they needed to speak to London with one voice.
And that led to the Stamp Act Congress in October 1765. This was huge.
Delegates from 9 different colonies all meeting in one place. That almost never happened back then.
It was basically unheard of. And they drafted a formal petition to the king and Parliament. They said, look, we're loyal subjects, but you cannot tax us without representation.
It was the first time they all came together to solve a common problem.
And it showed they could act as one. But petitions are one thing. The real weapon they used was economic.
The boycotts.
Yes. American merchants all agreed to just stop importing British goods.
So things like cloth, tools, tea.
All of it. They just stopped buying. And they tried to make what they needed themselves.
And you can't talk about this without mentioning the absolutely vital role of women.
Not at all. The boycotts would have failed without them. The Sons of Liberty were on the streets, but women were the engine of this economic war.
How so?
They organized spinning bees, getting together to spin thread and weave their own cloth to replace the British imports. It turned a household chore into a major political act.
So they're feeling the pressure in London from the protests, from the petitions, and now from these boycotts. How badly did that hurt the British economy?
Oh, it was devastating for them. British merchants and manufacturers started losing a ton of money, almost overnight.
And I bet they started complaining to Parliament.
Loudly. They began demanding that Parliament repeal the act because it was wrecking their businesses and causing unemployment back in Britain.
So now the pressure's coming from all sides.
It is. And at the same time, you have Benjamin Franklin in London speaking before Parliament. He was brilliant. He warned them plainly, the colonists will never ever pay this tax.
And he had allies in Parliament, like William Pitt.
Yes, influential leaders who saw that the tax was causing way more trouble than it was worth.
And finally it worked. The pressure was too much.
It worked. In March of 1766, Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act.
And the colonies just erupted in celebration.
Huge celebrations, bonfires, parties, bells ringing. They thought they had won a total victory. They thought everything was back to normal with the king.
But, yeah, and this is such a critical but, there was a hidden warning in that
A
victory.
huge one. On the exact same day that they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed something else, the Declaratory Act.
Which most people probably missed because they were too busy celebrating.
They did. And the Declaratory Act was Parliament essentially saying, fine, we'll take this one tax back, but don't get any ideas.
What did it declare exactly?
It stated that Great Britain had total authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
In all cases whatsoever. So
Yeah.
that includes taxes.
That includes taxes. They were doubling down on their power. They repealed the Stamp Act because it was bad for business, not because they thought the colonists were right.
So it's like they were saying, we back down this time, but don't you forget who's in charge.
Precisely. The core problem, the question of who had the ultimate power to tax, was not solved at all. It was just kicked down the road.
When you look back at all this, what's the biggest long-term takeaway?
I think the most important thing is that it brought the 13 colonies together in a way nothing had before. They started to see themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans.
And they built the tools to stay connected, right?
Yes, things like the committees of correspondence. These were basically networks to share information and coordinate their protests across the colonies. Before this, news traveled so slowly. Now they could act together and quickly.
The media also played a huge role, didn't it? The printers.
A massive role. Since their newspapers were being taxed, printers became some of the loudest voices against the act. Many just printed their papers without the stamps, which was a huge act of defiance.
They were spreading the arguments against Britain to the general public.
Exactly. They helped educate people and build support for the resistance.
So really, the Stamp Act crisis was the ultimate training ground for the revolution.
It absolutely was. It taught the colonists that they could resist. It showed them that through organization, boycotts, and unified political action, they could stand up to the most powerful empire in the world. All the methods they used later, they perfected here.
The fight proved that organized people could challenge a powerful government, but that core disagreement over who was really in charge was left like a ticking time bomb.
And a question for you to think about is this. If Britain had just repealed the tax and not passed the Declaratory Act, could things have gone differently? Would that have been enough to repair the relationship?
That's it for this look at the roots of American resistance. Good luck with your studies.